German inflation eases to 2% in December. Venezuela's Rodriguez says that economy grew 8.5% in 2025. And foreign holdings of U.S. Treasuries rebound to a record $9.355 trillion in November. Welcome to our economic news bulletin with me, Al Hamalawi, and we start off with Europe, where the Federal Statistical Office, Distatus, has reported that Germany's inflation eased in December, with the annual average rate slowing to 2.2%. The year-on-year increase in the Consumer Price Index stood at 1.8% in December 2025, marking a continued slowdown towards year-end and the first reading below 2% in 2025. Inflation was last lower in September 2024 when it stood at 1.6%. The National Statistics Institute has reported that Spain's European Union harmonized 12-month inflation rate fell to 3.0% in December. Core inflation, which strips out volatile fresh food and energy prices, was 2.6% in the 12 months through December. Spanish national consumer prices also fell 2.9% in the 12 months through December, slightly down from 3.0% in the period through November. The Economy Ministry said that moderation in overall inflation in December is explained mainly by the fall in fuel prices. It added that inflation for food and non-alcoholic beverages stood at 3% in the last month of the year, 0.2% higher than in November, mostly due to the base effect on oils and fats. French President Emmanuel Macron has unveiled a plan to add 36 billion euros to the country's multi-year defense budget in the next update. He noted that France needed to be more powerful in order to be feared amid rising geopolitical tensions. Macron added that the focus would include increasing ammunition stocks and strengthening troop readiness. France's government has suspended parliamentary talks on its 2026 budget until Tuesday, after lawmakers failed to reach a compromise, giving the prime minister time to consider options to advance the legislation without a vote. Budget Minister Amélie de Montchalin said that the extremes have voted for amendments to make the budget unvotable. She noted that Prime Minister Sébastien Lecornu is expected to present an amended version of the budget bill in an effort to reach a compromise before talks resume. Moreover, a government source said that Lecornu could invoke Article 49.3 to pass the budget without a vote, though he has pledged to avoid it and seek a parliamentary agreement. And for further analysis, we're joined from London by the Director of EU ASEAN Centre and former World Bank advisor, Mr. Meher Nicholas Fresley. Welcome to Qnews, sir. Also a pleasure having you. Let me start by asking you, how might the ongoing parliamentary impasse on France's 2026 budget, including the risk of invoking Article 49.3, exacerbate fiscal deficits beyond the projected 4.9% of GDP and drag French GDP growth by an estimated 0.2 percentage points or even more?
Delighted to join you today. It's almost a perfect crisis for France, or a perfect storm. And so I think it goes beyond simply the budget for fiscal year 2026. This is the top line, visible part of the iceberg. But there are deeper things at play. And I think it's much more than a budget. It's much more than what the newspaper will say, that it's just, restive MPs in parliament who don't want to vote the reasonable budget by a minority government led by the Macron people, or what's left of them. It's much deeper than that. It's a constitutional crisis and a political crisis. Why am I saying that? Because the thing which allows, worst case scenario, Tuesday, we expect the president and the prime minister to make speeches and to say that there's a crisis. And what will they say on Tuesday? In essence, they will say that they have played the game, that, Prime Minister Le Cornu is a nice guy, he's a reasonable centrist, he's not the slave of Macron, that Le Cornu, the Prime Minister, has his own will, which of course is a lie, because Le Cornu is a simple puppet who obeys all the orders of Macron. He's not a real Prime Minister in the full sense, but they would pretend that he did everything he could, even going against the grain of Macron, to reach a compromise solution with who? With what's left of the center-right conservative Gaullist and what's left of the center-left socialist labor, with the middle being the Macron people, right? Mm-hmm. And the Macron people are still big enough to form a minority government. That's the government led by Le Cornu, but in public opinion, they completely collapsed. So less than 10% of French voters respect them or support them. And so what they will do next week, most likely, is use one of two constitutional tricks they could use to impose their will against Parliament. The first one, as you mentioned, is called Article 49.3 or 49 Chapter 3. What does it mean? So it means that the government itself triggers a parliamentary crisis, and they tell the center-left and center-right parties, which are outside of the government, but they have been backing the Macron government, they tell them, you guys, now you have to put your cards on the table. You've been backing us for a while, but you are making trouble when it comes to the budget. Listen, now is the moment of truth, and that is 49.3. Article 49.3 forces these parties to put their cards on the table, and so they either censor the government, and therefore the whole, what is the next step if you censor the government? You automatically trigger elections, you automatically trigger parliamentary elections, and the center-left socialists and the center-right Gaullists, just like the Macron people, they are, despised and hated by public opinion. So if they trigger that no confidence vote, and if we have snap elections, very likely the far right and the far left will win. So it's a way of pressuring the center left and center right, tell them, give us a break, vote the budget, or else we press the nuclear button, we dissolve parliament, and we go to snap elections.
I see. So, sir, in what ways could prolonged budget uncertainty from failed compromises deter private investment and consumer spending in France, potentially spilling over to weaken the Eurozone growth forecast for 2026?
It will come. So personally, I believe...
It's inevitable. It will happen.
Yeah, it will come, but not so soon, not so fast. So I think this is the next stage. So what you describe, which is France potentially triggering a bigger Eurozone financial crisis, is a very likely possibility, but I think it will take another 2, 3 months because the Macron people haven't exhausted all their cards, and I think they will cling to power. And so, what do I mean? So, we just talked about Article 49.3, right?
Yes.
But there's another constitutional trick which I think they will use next week, which I think is more dangerous. But people like Macron don't care about that, and so it's called in French law ordinance, and so it's something they can do in the French Constitution. So ordinance are like executive orders or executive action. What does it mean? In theory, you should only do that in case of big crisis, like a civil war, like a war, a civil
Yes.
war, an earthquake. But people in Macron and his entourage don't care. So I think they'll be tempted to do that. So what's an ordinance? In English you have the word ordinance.
Yes.
So yeah, order. What's an order? You are a dictator,
Mm-hmm.
and you give an order to the people, right? So it's not democracy. It's a decree, a directive, a command by a general or a dictator. But there's another word in English which is linked to ordinance. It's ordinance. And what does it mean in English, ordinance? It means the weapons and ammunitions that are used to supply the army. So if you are a weapon manufacturer, you supply the armed forces with ordnance. And it's no coincidence. All these are French words: order, ordinance, and ordinance. And it's no coincidence because who wrote the French Constitution? Well, it's a bunch of generals. General de Gaulle and his people in 58, 59, they wrote that Fifth Republic Constitution along very centralized, presidential, strong executive branch, military worldview. But these people were not dictators. General de Gaulle was a very reasonable man, but he wanted to avoid chaos.
Yes.
So he put in the Constitution these tools, and he said, we'll only use these tools if there is a war, a civil war, something like that. And what is horrible is Macron and Le Cornu in the coming days are very likely to use these tools just for the sake of clinging to political power.
Yes.
And that is very cynical, and it's a recipe for disaster.
So to what extent will President Macron's 36 billion euros addition to the multi-year defense budget, prioritizing ammunition and troop readiness, actually stimulate short-term GDP through rearmament, while also straining public debt, servicing costs now projected at 59.3 billion euros in 2026?
I think it doesn't amount to much. So the classic, the classic Keynesian theory is, the government spends money, it goes to weapon factories, weapon manufacturers, it's good for the GDP, right? But I think that the quantities we're talking about are minuscule. And I think that where Macron failed miserably, he believed wrongly that the Poles and the Irish and the Spaniards and the Belgians and the Ukrainians, they would massively buy French weapons because Trump is tough with them. And exactly the opposite happened. Even though it's true, Trump was very tough with the Danes, with the Poles, with the Europeans, with the Greek, But at the end of the day, European countries, even though Trump pressured them and sometimes humiliated them, they kept on buying F-35 jets, right? They never stopped buying American fighter jets and moved to French-made Rafale fighters. So the whole, Macron bet that a European war economy would profit French military firms failed. And France alone cannot by itself jumpstart the economic growth engine only by itself ordering new airplanes and new missiles. I think they were betting wrongly and stupidly on the fact that out of European solidarity, their neighbors would also buy made in France weapons. It never happened.
Yes. Well, from London, that was the director of EU-ASEAN Center, former World Bank advisor, Mr. Maher Nicholas Fursley. Thank you so much, sir, for your insights, for the analysis that I would say it's economic, political, historical, and even linguistic. Thank you so much, sir. Now back again to our news, and still in Europe, the Bank of England Governor Andrew Bailey has stated that financial policymakers had to push back against attempts by populist politicians to discredit them, noting that populism made it harder for global agencies such as the International Monetary Fund to spell out risks in the world economy. He said that attempts had been made to encourage a decline in trust of quote-unquote domestic and international organizations to make them appear distant, unresponsive, and acting for the benefit of powerful and uncontrollable interests. Bailey added that now was not the time to close the world to the benefits of trade. He also pointed out the importance of rules to make the global finance industry safe was not as widely accepted as it should be. Reuters reported that a closed-door hearing at a Moscow court in the Russian central bank's 18.2 trillion rubles lawsuit against Belgium's Euroclear has been adjourned until spring. The case follows the European Union plan to use frozen Russian sovereign assets in Europe, mostly held at Euroclear, to back a loan to Ukraine. During the hearing, Euroclear's lawyers unsuccessfully sought to have the case dismissed. Meanwhile, central bank lawyers argued for closed proceedings, citing state secrecy and the unprecedented sums involved. In Asia, the Commerce Department has reported that India's trade deficit widened to $25 billion in December, as imports grew 9% to $63.6 billion, driven by electronics, fertilizer, and silver shipments. In contrast, exports went up 1.9% to $38.5 billion, with the value of consignments to the U.S. staying flat. Exports to the U.S. were estimated at $6.9 billion in December 2025. Imports were 7.6% higher at $4 billion, driven by a 40 to 50% jump in oil shipments. Commerce Secretary Rajesh Agrawal noted that the country has been holding well, citing positive territory. He said that India could end the year with over $850 billion exports, with services for the first time likely to cross the $400 billion mark. Annual decline last year as sales and prices fell in December. Home sales fell 2.7% in December from November, while they were down 4.5% year over year without seasonal adjustment. For 2025, sales decreased 1.9% from the previous year to 470,314 units. The association forecasts that sales would rise a 5.1% this year, led by British Columbia and Ontario, and that the average price would increase 2.8%. And its forecast for 2027 showed sales climbing a further 3.5% and the average price up 2.3%. Moving on to Latin America, Venezuela's interim president, Delcy Rodriguez, has announced that the country's economy grew 8.5% on a yearly basis in 2025. Speaking to the parliament in the capital, Caracas, she emphasized that the economy has grown uninterrupted for 19 quarters. Rodriguez added that Venezuela is one of the leading economies in Latin America. Meanwhile, Venezuela's interim president, Delcy Rodriguez, has stated that she will submit a proposal to parliament to reform the organic hydrocarbons law, citing what she called unprecedented success over the past decade, including producing all domestically supplied gasoline without importing fuel. She also announced plans to create two sovereign funds to manage all foreign currency entering the country, along with a technology platform to ensure transparent, efficient use of the resources and prevent bureaucracy and corruption. Rodriguez said that the funds would be used to improve capitals, schools, housing, and public services.
Nunca rectando ni arrastrándome. Será de pie, es lo que corresponde como un venezolano o como una venezolana de pie.
And for further analysis, we're joined from Buenos Aires by international relations researcher Tobias Belgrano. Welcome to Qnews. Now, let me start by asking you, how might Venezuela's reported 8.5% economic growth in 2025, driven by 19 consecutive quarters of expansion, impact its standing among the Latin American economies and influence regional trade dynamics?
Well, we have to remember that Venezuela, despite this year's expansion, has been through many years. I mean, since almost 8 years of economic contractions, especially since 2013, after Hugo Chavez died and Maduro assumed power in 2014 and onwards. The economy contracted very strongly, especially due to the prices of the oil, and after that, because of economic sanctions due to the Western's influence against the economic sanctions. So this new growth from Venezuela, it won't affect that much the trade dynamics in the region. However, the new scenario posed by the U.S. intervention and the new expansion and promises of investments by the U.S. to the Caribbean nation Venezuela might have a stronger impact in the regional commerce, especially also with countries that compete also in the oil industry with Venezuela, like Brazil. So I think that in the future we're going to see new impacts of this expansion of the Venezuelan economy. However, I don't think this current year's growth will have a strong impact also in living standards. I mean, the standards of living in Venezuela were very degraded, especially during the Maduro administration.
Mm-hmm. Sir, to what extent could interim President Delcy Rodriguez's proposed reforms to the organic hydrocarbons law attract foreign investment in Venezuela's oil sector, given, of course, the country's self-sufficiency in gasoline production?
Well, in the idea of the Trump administration is to keep expanding the investments in the oil in Venezuela. The idea of Mr. Trump has been to show the new face of the Venezuelan administration. Despite we're talking about politicians that were a few weeks ago beside Nicolás Maduro, now we're talking about politicians that are trying to show how the new administration in Venezuela, it's clean, it's transparent, and trying to show the investors, show attractiveness to investors to get their investments in Venezuela's oil industry. That has a structural problems, especially on the production of the oil. Venezuela, we have to remember that, especially during the Maduro administration, started to lose their capability of refining oil. So now they are in the need of foreign investment to get more infrastructure. That's the aim of the partial reform of the hydrocarbon law that the interim president Delcy Rodriguez has presented to the National Assembly in Venezuela. And I think this reform is very likely to pass, not only because of the majority that Chavismo has in the National Assembly, but also because of the president of the National Assembly, of the Legislative National Assembly, is Delcy Rodriguez's brother. So I think that Delcy Rodriguez is trying to show her capability of govern against the instability, the previous instability what was Maduro, to show the investors that she's a strong leadership and that the investments are secure if they invest in Venezuela. I think that's the general trend of the idea. The reform is in that sense, and the institutional strengths and show that they are capable to govern is the other part of the deal, to show the investors the Venezuelan new administration can be trusted.
So in what ways would the establishment of two sovereign funds for managing foreign currency inflows enhance transparency and efficiency in public spending on hospitals, schools, and infrastructure under Rodriguez's administration? You just told me that she wants to prove herself as a good ruler. So how do you see that?
Yeah, I mean, the idea will also include to get a little popular legitimacy by having an improvement in the living standards in Venezuela that have been very deteriorated during the Maduro administration. So if the people see that there's a slight improvement in the living standards, probably that will bring popularity to her. Despite that, she was a leader that was chosen by Mr. Trump because of her capability of getting the support of key veto players in the Venezuelan political establishment, such as the army, such as the intelligence system, such as the civil militias that are called the colectivos. So these funds will probably also enhance her probability of getting more popularity among, especially the most marginalized communities in Venezuela that are very postponed, especially by Chavismo in the last few years.
Well, from Buenos Aires, that was international relations researcher Mr. Tobias Belgrano. Thank you so much, sir, for your insights. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we move to the latest developments in the United States. The Treasury Department has revealed that foreign holdings of U.S. Treasuries rebounded to a record $9.355 trillion in November, up from $9.243 trillion in October and 7.2% higher year-on-year as market sentiment improved after the U.S. government shut down. The increase was led by Japan, the United Kingdom, Belgium, and Canada. Japan remained the largest foreign holder with $1.202 trillion, its highest level since July 2022. The UK, the second largest holder, increased its holdings to $888.5 billion, up 1.2% from October. Canada boosted its holdings by 13% to a record $472.2 billion. In contrast, China's holdings fell to $682.6 billion, the lowest level since September 2008. The Federal Reserve reported that U.S. factory production unexpectedly rose 0.2% in December, boosted by a surge in primary metals output that offset declines in motor vehicle assembly plants. Manufacturing output increased 2.0% year-on-year, reflecting strong industrial demand late in the year. However, overall factory activity contracted 0.7% annualized in the fourth quarter, down from 2.8% growth in the third quarter, as manufacturers faced headwinds from import tariffs and supply chain pressures. In the commodities sector, oil prices rose over 1% on Friday as supply risks remained in focus. Despite the receding likelihood of a U.S. military strike against Iran, Brent crude was up 1.3% to $64.60 a barrel, on course for a fourth consecutive weekly gain. U.S. West Texas Intermediate was up 80 cents or 1.4% to $59.99. At those levels, Brent was on course for a 2% weekly gain and WTI for a 1.4% gain. Gold fell more than 1% on Friday as investors booked profits after recent record highs, while signs of easing geopolitical tensions further dampened the metal safe haven appeal. Spot gold was down 1% at $4,567.89 per ounce. However, the metal is poised for its second consecutive weekly gain of about 1.3% after scaling a record peak of $4,642.72 on Wednesday. U.S. gold futures for February delivery fell 1.1% to $4,570.90. Elsewhere, spot silver shed 4.5% to $88.14 per ounce, although it was headed for a weekly gain of over 10% after hitting an all-time high of $93.57 in the previous session. And that brings us to the end of our economic news bulletin. But before we wrap it up, here is a quick recap of what we have covered. German inflation eases to 2% in December. Venezuela's Rodriguez says economy grew 8.5% in 2025. And foreign holdings of U.S. Treasuries rebound to a record $9.355 trillion in November. That's all for today's Economic News Roundup. I'm Hala Al-Hamalawi. Thank you so much for joining us. Stay tuned, stay ahead, and we'll be back with the latest updates tomorrow. But for now, don't forget to follow Q News on YouTube, Facebook, X, Instagram, and TikTok at QNewsEG to always stay informed.